Welcome back, everyone. I'm here to talk about tribal psychology in contemporary times. This is based on my recent book, Tribal. The subtitle is How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Bring Us Together. And I wrote this book to kind of provide a playbook for those of you who manage and lead and want to harness culture so that it's your friend rather than an obstacle. And it came because there's been a real change in how academics think about culture in different disciplines. When I was in school, a lot of classes started with the question, nature versus nurture. And if it was a biology class, the right answer was nature. And if it was a sociology class, the right answer was nurture. But that's how it was framed. But in the last decade or so, there's a new answer that a lot of consensus has formed around, which is that human nature, the nature of our species, is nurture. And what that means is that we are the animals wired to internalize the ways of the community that nurtures us and the many communities that nurture us. So we internalize multiple cultures or tribes. And that turned out to be the most important thing about our species that explains why it's so special, why it lives so differently from all the other primates and all the other animals. Early humans' brains became wired with psychological systems for learning and using culture. And that's the most important thing about us. Because of this, we began to live in tribes, larger and larger groups that were bound together by shared ideas. And that allowed the circle of trust to expand much more broadly than it does in any other primate species or any other animal species, beyond kith and kin, to total strangers who we can trust because they share our culture. They're predictable to us and thus trustworthy to us. Now, for the real evolutionary backstory about how these cultural instincts evolved and how it changed early humans and led to the modern era, you'll have to get the book, because if I start talking about that, I'll be talking for hours. But I break it down into three major waves of evolution. One that I call the peer instinct, where we evolved the side of us that is conformist, that pays attention to what our peers are doing and feels impelled to join them, to mesh with them. The next one I call the hero instinct. And this is the side of our psychology that wants to contribute to the community and gain status and the tribute that comes along with status. It's what we might think of as, our aspirational side, our ethical side. And then the final wave of tribal instincts that distinguishes our species came in the last 100,000 years, and it's probably the most curious of the three. It's the ancestor instinct. It's the urge to hang on to the ways of the past. It's our extreme curiosity about what the elders are saying. It's the deep satisfaction we feel in maintaining the ways of our ancestors. And this turned out to be a really important piece of the puzzle because it created tribal memory. Once people were wired to hang on to the ways of the past, even if they didn't understand why those ways of the past were instrumentally useful, that meant that the knowledge of the past generations, the wisdom of the past, would carry forward even through periods when it wasn't used. Now, these three waves of tribal psychology are still with us today. They're still the psychology that explains why people adhere to the cultures of their groups, and they correspond to three basic layers that any culture will have, whether it's the culture of a society, like American culture, the culture of an industry, like engineering culture, or the culture of an organization, like CBS culture, or IBM culture, or Apple culture. Now, there's lots of nuances beyond these three major cuts, but there's a lot of leverage that you can gain if you understand the psychology involved in these three basic layers of culture. In particular, culture is dynamic. We all internalize multiple cultures, so they can't all be at the fore of our brains at the same time. So as a leader, one thing you want to do is manage cultural codes. You want to activate them. You want to bring them to the fore to create unity, to create motivation, to create coordination. Another thing you sometimes need to do as a leader is change the cultural codes. If what you need from a group is something different than they've done before, the environment has changed, you need a new strategy, you need a new culture to support that strategy, then you need to know how to engineer a new culture, how to create a shift in the culture, how to guide the evolution of the culture. And so what I'd like to do with you briefly today is just share a story with you about each of these things that illustrates how the framework of the book can show you how to manage cultural codes and to change cultural codes. Okay, for managing cultural codes, the book describes three kinds of tribal triggers. Triggers are features of the environment, the immediate situation that you're in, that bring a culture to the fore, that bring it to the front of your mind. And the triggers associated with these three layers of culture, I call tribal signs, symbols, and ceremonies. Now, that's very abstract, and it's best to just illustrate it with a story, something close to home that you guys will understand. My story here comes from an event about 10 or 12 years ago when then-time Dean Glenn Hubbard came to me and said, "Michael, you're the culture expert on the faculty. I think we've got a cultural problem, which is that we have this estimable tradition of Columbia Business School, but it doesn't seem to be in the fore of people's minds. It's not the identity that people think about all the time, both the students and the faculty." We had a funny thing in alumni surveys at around that time where when we would ask alumni, how do you feel about Columbia Business School? You know, it was positive, but it was like 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. We weren't getting like the 9 out of 10 that we wanted. But then if we asked a different question, how do you feel about those 2 years of your life when you were doing your MBA? 9 out of 10. You know, so people had no second thoughts, no reservations about having come to Columbia Business School, but they somehow weren't giving Columbia Business School credit for how much fun and how much they learned during those 2 years. So the Columbia identity needed to be more central. Similarly for the faculty, we were in these little silos of the management division, the marketing division, the accounting division, and we didn't think much about Columbia Business School as an identity. So I was part of a task force with one person from each division, and we spent about a year analyzing the problem, and we saw many sides of the problem. But basically, what we concluded was the problem was the environment. Students were on the main campus, lost in the crowd, mixed in with students of every variety. The only cultural symbols around were these somewhat cryptic objects. You know, the one symbol, the intentional symbol, was the Hermes symbol, but most people thought it was a 4, you know, because they didn't know what the Hermes was, and some people were pronouncing it like the French tie company rather than Hermes. So it's not Hermes, it's Hermes, you know. But we didn't have really salient symbols. And as for ceremonies, there was no room to have ceremonies like the one that we're at today. We had to have those on other locations. So I suggested to the dean the best solution was to wait and then make a big push for cultural change when we had a change of campus. We could reset the culture when we moved to this wonderful new campus. So now we're here, and we have this amazing building that has won awards, and that symbolizes some of the ideals that we want to be central to the culture. So it's one of the most advanced climate progressive buildings in New York City. It's won awards for that, and that climate change is now one of the pillars of the Columbia identity. It's a differentiator. And we designed the buildings around central staircases so that the MBA students see almost every other MBA student every day, because these staircases are conduits for the whole community to go through. So what we've achieved is that our MBA students are now surrounded by their fellow MBA peers, They are constantly exposed to symbols of what we stand for, an innovative and climate change friendly building. And they are frequently exposed to ceremonial events like this one that stir the traditional feelings that are also part of a culture. And if you want to understand a little more about what I'm saying, you're going to have to read the book, because I don't have time to go into all of it. But I do want to share the second story with you in my final 5 minutes, and that is, how can an organization change the culture? Sometimes organizations have to change their internal culture, but what's even harder is when a company realizes it needs to change the popular culture around it. It needs to change the culture of the customers. It's not enough to have a good technology. You have to have norms for using the technology, and so companies have to be cultural entrepreneurs sometimes and change the culture. An example of this, and I'm going to argue that you can change cultures through sending tribal signals, and three really important kinds for the three kinds of cultural codes are prevalence signals, prestige signals, and precedent signals. Prevalent signals are signaling that something is widespread. Prestige signals are signaling that something is associated with status. And precedent signals are signaling that something is established, that it's part of a tradition, it's something that the past generations have done. So my example here is a company that we all remember, Kodak. You know, it was one of the prominent companies of the 20th century. And at the start of the 20th century, Kodak had a near monopoly on film for amateur cameras. But they faced a cultural barrier, which is that at the time, people felt that portraits were a serious matter, a kind of grim affair, best left to the professional photographers in their studios. And the professional photographers had a custom at the time of asking the sitters to say the word prunes, leading to photographs like this one. And if you have photographs of your ancestors like that, you may have sometimes formed the impression that, wow, these were grim people. You know, I'm relieved that I never met them in person. But they actually weren't so grim. The Victorians weren't such grim people. It's just that the first cameras had a very slow shutter speed, which required sitters to hold their face perfectly still for over a minute. And you can't do that with a smile. So they just decided we would get people to hold a serious expression by saying the word prunes. But like the QWERTY keyboard and many other social conventions, it perpetuated, and it lasted as a tradition even after cameras advanced to the point where they could hold a fleeting smile. So what did Kodak do? They launched a long-running campaign across several decades. They created a camera called the Brownie that was user-friendly. It was kind of like the first Macintosh, but it was a camera. And they made it a loss leader. They sold it for $1, and they also gave it away to college campuses, to YMCAs, to scout troops, so that young, enthusiastic people would be out in the parks taking pictures of each other. Kodak also created magazines where they perpetuated terms like shutterbug and snapshot, so people could understand this idea of amateur photography. And they had slogans like, "Save your happy family memories with a snapshot," making parents feel that it was the right thing to do. It was the prestigious thing to do. Americans started seeing more and more smiling faces. They also involved Hollywood celebrities, and celebrities like aviatrix and Columbia alumni Amelia Earhart, who was a big smiler. So people started seeing high prestige people smiling. And the final coup de grace was that Kodak sponsored school pictures and the custom of saying cheese, which was a novelty, saying cheese instead of saying prunes. And so the result is captured in this results of a study where they took a composite photo of high school yearbooks from a bunch of American high schools across all the decades of the 20th century. And you can see that the dead eyes and the pressed lips of the early decades become replaced by subtle grins and then eventually full-blown smiles and twinkling eyes. And now we have an epidemic of smiling that even shows up in mugshots. We've had some recent stories about this. This should be an unhappy event, but people are smiling, even relatively smart people like Bill Gates, politicians. But not everyone smiles. You know, we can still, if we try hard, we can still not smile. So that gives you a flavor of the book. It has won the attention of critics, but the attention that matters is yours. People buy books when their friends tell them it's interesting, so please help spread the word. You can scan this to the book's website. Thanks so much for your attention. It's great to see you all back.